Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our top tier review series with the nation of Sweden. In this video, we'll be ranking each of the categories from Sweden from S, best in category, to A, very good, B, average, C, poor, or F, nothing suitable. We will also be looking at the various categories in descending order from the most important all the way down to the least important. And as a bit of an aside, part of the reason why it took a while for Sweden was not only did I want to take my time and make sure I spaded and researched enough vehicles to have a good idea of how they performed at top tier and try out a few different options, but the developers kept adding a bunch of other vehicles that kept changing the paradigm of how Sweden played. At this point, I feel like it's stable enough to give a more accurate assessment. And as always, we will be kicking things off by looking at Sweden's MBT lineup. Sweden has about 4 options that you could reasonably take into a top tier match and do perfectly fine with. The options are the Stridsvagn 122B+, the Stridsvagn 122B PLSS, the Stridsvagn 122A, and the Finnish Leopard 2A6. The main strength of these Stridsvagn 122s, essentially all of them, is that they noticeably improve the protection of the Leopard 2 family, being some of the better protected Leopards at top tier. The only real competition they have are the 2 Leopard 2A7s. The 122 family prominently features reinforced upper front plate armor and spall liners across the entire family, and the 122B+ adds further reinforcing on the upper sides of the tank and also on the turret sides. This gives the 122B+ reasonably strong frontal protection across most of the frontal arc, and the addition of the spall liner frequently allows it to survive penetrating hits without getting destroyed. In addition, all of the Leopard 2s prominently feature a 1500 horsepower engine, and even the Stridsvagn 122s with their reinforced armor don't get above around 63 tons, so on the whole the tanks are still pretty nimble and still pretty agile. The main vulnerability of the 122 family is really that its top shell is pretty unimpressive. The M95 shell from the L44 gun isn't exactly a world beater. Its somewhat modest penetration doesn't allow it to really do anything that other shells couldn't, and the reload is pretty average for top tier. The Leopard 2A6 does noticeably increase the gun performance by adding the L55 gun and getting access to DM53, but it does so at expense of all of the add-on armor the 122s get, and also doesn't have the spall liner either. So while the 2A6 is faster and more nimble with a punchier gun, it's not as durable or as tanky as the 122s. I wouldn't say either of those differences necessarily constitute major downsides to the tanks, however, as the 122s simply favor more close-up brawly playstyles, whereas the 2A6 favors more flanking and sniping playstyles. That being said, there are some drawbacks that affect basically the entire Leopard family. The first one, I've mentioned this several times, is that the rear ammo rack in the back of the turret only holds 15 rounds, so if you go above 15 rounds plus 1 in the chamber for 17 rounds, now it starts going into the front of the hull, which is a very easy place to hit. So any more than 16 rounds in the tank can make it excessively vulnerable to ammo detonations, and this can limit you, especially if you're on longer range maps where it may take more than 1 shot per opponent. Additionally, over the last few updates, 2 fairly prominent nerfs to the entire Leopard 2 family have negatively affected their performance. The first one is the turret depression. The gun depression, if you go past basically the 90-degree angle on either side, the gun will actually raise rather significantly to avoid the engine deck. This does mean that if your engine or driver is disabled, it's easier to get around to a position where the Leopard can't shoot back, especially if you're on a shorter vehicle like a Russian one, than it is on basically any other contemporary tank. The other issue was the addition of the turret basket, which now counts as a turret ring. This dramatically increases the area that you can hit and disable the ability to turn the turret at all, which also means that a lot of hits to the engine will now just incidentally disable the turret, and a lot of hits to the driver will also incidentally disable the turret. That being said, none of these drawbacks severely negatively impact the performance of the Leopard family, because it turns out at top tier, if you're suffering penetrating hits, you should broadly just assume those penetrating hits will be fatal, and most of these are not really that relevant in most cases. Or to put that in simpler terms, if you suffer a penetrating hit and you're not dead, that means your opponent just couldn't aim, and if they had aimed a little better, you would be dead. Given the overall variety you have in terms of playstyles and attributes within the Swedish Leopard 2 family, it's hard to give them anything lower than an A grade. However, the major factor that's keeping Sweden from getting all the way up to an S grade is, while they do have the Leopards with the best durability and the Leopard with the best gun, they're not on the same Leopard. You can either take the 2A6 and have the punchier gun with the better mobility, or you can take the 122s and have the more durable Leopard. Whereas if you're playing either Germany or Italy, you can simply have a Leopard that hits hard and is also durable. On top of that, it's hard to not have the 2A6 in the lineup because it is noticeably more mobile and does have a noticeably punchier punchier gun that makes some engagements, especially at longer ranges, pretty easy. And this does kind of mean that your backup tank is essentially just a carbon copy of the German Leopard 2A6. So compared to Germany that has the 2A7V as its primary and 2A6 as its secondary, Sweden has your preferred Stridsvagn 122 as your primary and also a Leopard 2A6 as your secondary. So in that case, I do think Sweden, until you start getting into third or fourth MBTs, is generally worse than Germany, but still an excellent MBT lineup on the whole. Next up, we have anti-air, and Sweden currently has two viable options for a top tier anti-air. First off is the Ito 90M, and second we have the Eld 98. Now this is pretty interesting because the Eld was a fairly recent addition to this tech tree, but the Ito 90M did get a buff in terms of the anti-aircraft radar screen that does make its missile tracking particularly accurate and effective at longer ranges. The overall strength of the Ito 90M is that the Ito 90M does have 8 ready to fire missiles, and those missiles do have pretty good range, speed, and generally pretty good pull as well. However, the drawback of the Ito 90M is that it's kind of a brick house, and at this point its radar is not really exceptional, although it is generally adequate. Whereas the main strength of the Eld is that the Eld has fire and forget infrared missiles which can track, lock, and go after targets without necessarily giving them a radar ping, and also generally has a better radar and a smaller silhouette. The main drawback of the Eld, and this is the real kneecap for it, is that the Eld only has a whopping 4 missiles, and the range on the Eld is not that exceptional. So if you're fighting something like a Su-30 SM, it can launch all of its missiles before you can realistically return fire, and with only 4 missiles ready to go, the Eld does somewhat struggle to intercept more than a handful of them before getting plastered. On top of that, the Eld is not exactly a particularly fast or durable vehicle in its own right. Now, ultimately, the question when looking at these two 12.0 anti-aircraft systems is which one do you choose? And anecdotally, at this point, I found that any good or competent pilot was trying to avoid things like the American SlamRam or the German Iris-T system, and this really outclassed the Eld and the Ito 90M in terms of their intercept capabilities because both of those systems are generally just better. That being said, the major tactic that people use to try and avoid those systems is by exposing themselves as little as possible to reduce the window to fire the missiles, or staying at very low altitude until they're about ready to do their final attack run. And in those scenarios, the Ito 90M does struggle to keep up. You almost need the Eld because the Eld is the only one that will reliably land hits against opponents that are only giving you brief windows to shoot at them, because it does use a fire and forget missile. With that being said, I would broadly give the Swedish anti-air at this point a roughly B grade. I think both of these systems are going to do perfectly fine against the average plane or the average pilot at top tier. Their missiles have the range to do the job against basically everything but the best enemies you could theoretically fight, and generally speaking, their radars are adequate for most engagements. However, really good pilots or some of the longer range or more annoying aircraft to deal with are going to be a major issue, and both of these basically just function as backup anti-airs for the longer range and more powerful systems that your team probably already has available. They're not bad, but against the best pilots and the best airframes, you can definitely find their limits stretched to the breaking point. Next up, we're looking at the light tanks, and Sweden actually has a lot of different light tanks that you could theoretically use at top tier, so I'm going to be going over the high points and looking at them one by one. We're going to give an honorable mention to the CTCV 105 HP, which is an old event vehicle. It's an 8x8 wheeled vehicle, but honestly it's a little underpowered for a wheeled vehicle, and the gun isn't really exceptional, so I don't think it performs all that well at top tier, at least not any better than some of the other options with single shot cannons. It is viable, but it's not particularly good. Continuing in the vein of single shot cannons, the CV9120 features a very punchy 120mm cannon with the same shell as the Swedish MBTs, so almost 600mm of penetration with a 5-second reload. Also features fairly good mobility and is an incredibly agile vehicle in basically all aspects. The major downside is the armor, and obviously you're not expecting that much armor, but significantly, because the ammo rack is basically in the back of the turret and doesn't have blowout panels, commonly if you just peek your turret over a hill and the enemy just clicks on the middle of your turret, they will just straight up kill you. That being said, the reload rate, the punchiness of the gun, and the general speed and agility of the vehicle do more than make up for this disadvantage and make it a pretty competent light tank. The various 9040s, of which there are quite a lot of examples, do deserve a brief shout out because I did do some testing with them and found most of them were pretty meh. They weren't really what you were looking for. Ironically, despite the shells they have actually being quite good, the dart on the 40mm is excellent, the VT fuse is excellent, even the Bill missiles on the 9040 Bill is generally pretty reliable. The problem is just the everything else. The 9040s are all universally underpowered compared to some of the other CV90s. Despite having a VT fuse, they don't have an auto tracker as standard, so you kind of have to manually aim, which really doesn't cut it all that much at top tier. On top of that, the gun falls out of stabilization once you get above a certain speed, so it can be pretty awkward to hit targets on the move, and coupled with the magazine size, it can be a somewhat awkward vehicle to use. It also doesn't have excellent armor or survivability. You can sometimes take hits, but they're not exactly great at it. It would be tempting to use something like the 9040 bill, but the bill launcher doesn't elevate up or down at all, so this leads to any scenario where you're on uneven ground as you either fire it up into orbit or down into the ground. So on the whole, I'm not actually sure the bill is the best answer. Something like the Lovkov 9040 that can act as a backup anti-air while also doing a lot of the light tank duties might legitimately be the better option, because it has the same gun as the 9040, but also has a radar and a tracking system that allows it to lock onto planes. But that's just my thoughts on it. The CV90 Mark IV does feature a slightly worse gun and shell in terms of overall penetration, but the shell is a continuous belt, it's fully stabilized, and in addition to that, the CV90 Mark IV does have a noticeably better engine than all of the 9040s. It also has spike missiles, and more importantly carries 6 spike missiles, whereas most of the spike missile carriers only have 4, so it does have a nice backup option to deal with helicopters, even though it doesn't have access to the proxy fuse. Overall, I do think the CV90 Mark IV in most cases is going to serve you better than the 9040 bill, even if on surface the main shell for the main gun does look a little worse. So the real question is, what grade do I give this overall lineup of light tanks? After all, just because you have a lot of options doesn't necessarily mean those options really elevate the lineup. I would say the biggest weakness of basically all of these different options is that the mobility is not dramatically better than your MBT lineup. This is the same issue I had with vehicles like the Puma VJTF or the Nommers, in that if you're essentially the same mobility as your MBT lineup, what are you really bringing to the table in a lot of instances? With that being said though, I will say the 9120 and the 90 Mark IV are noticeably more agile than the MBT lineup. The 90 Mark IV does bring some extra versatility because of the spike autocannon combo, and the 9120 does shoot noticeably faster than the MBTs with basically the same gun in all other respects. So on the whole, I would say this is a pretty solid S-grade light tank lineup. You have basically both of the major avenues covered. You can get a punchy light tank sniper, and you can also get a more brawly light tank IFV, and both of them work pretty well in most situations. Next up, we're into the helicopters, and it is, spoiler, all downhill from here. The only two real helicopter options you have are the AHS, which is essentially an AH-64A model Apache, and the Mi-28A premium helicopter. And this is also where I'm going to briefly hit on the fact that despite being 10.7, the Mi-28A is not that far away from being a top tier capable helicopter, which I'll discuss momentarily. Now, in terms of the AHS, a lot of the things that I've said about Apaches previously in the series still hold true. Stingers and Hellfires are just not great missiles for the top tier environment. Stingers often struggle to lock other helicopters, they often cannot hit many of the planes you fight at all. Additionally, Hellfires are incredibly slow missiles that require you to laze targets for the entire flight time, and in addition to that, they will give the enemy a laser warning receiver as well. It's just the worst possible way to deliver a missile, on top of the fact that they can be casually defeated by smoke. Overall, the only scenario in which something like an AHS will work properly is a scenario in which any other helicopter would basically also be able to work. The Mi-28A is only at 10.7 because it doesn't have thermals, and this is where I'm going to get to one of the real caveats of this. If you have a 10.7 lineup, the Mi-28A is borderline broken at its own battle rating. But if you can live without thermals, which is entirely possible because you really shouldn't be using these helicopters that aggressively anyway, the Attackers are just generally better than the Hellfires, and the gun on the Mi-28A, in addition to the rocket pods, makes it a much better first spawner to rush the enemy. So it is more than possible that you could do as much, if not more, work with the Mi-28A than the AHS. It just kind of depends on how much of a deal breaker thermal imaging is for you. That being said, you can probably guess, but this is getting a C grade. These helicopters work on the most basic level possible. They do technically have rockets, guns, and anti-tank missiles. The AHS has some anti-aircraft missiles, but ultimately they only really work against opponents that are unaware or can't otherwise defend themselves, and in any scenarios where the airspace is contested, both of these helicopters really struggle. Next up, we have the fixed wing CAS, and the Swedish jets have always been pretty sad, honestly, even since the nation Nation's first introduction, but at this point they're not really changing the formula that much. Your two major options are the JAS-39C Gripen and the F-18C MLU for Finland. The problem is that both of these have some pretty harsh limitations that stop them from being truly effective at top tier. The Gripen does have access to Mavericks, laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided bombs, in addition to AMRAAMs and AIM-9Ms, and you might think that it's about to come away with a strong recommendation. The problem with the Gripen is that you have 6 hardpoints total, 2 of them have to be used for AIM-9Ms because they can't carry anything else, so you only have 4 hardpoints between all of your other air-to-air and air-to-ground. Additionally, the Gripen can only carry 1 Maverick per hardpoint, so if you carry 4 Mavericks plus 2 Sidewinders, that is your entire loadout. So doing mixes and matches of things like AMRAAMs and Mavericks means you're probably only going to have 1 or 2 of each, which isn't really enough to do all that much work. This is the major limitation of the Gripen. If the Gripen either had 6 packs of Mavericks or had an extra hardpoint that it could use for just air-to-air, I think it would actually be a little bit more capable. That being said, it's not useless. It has the weapons it needs, so it's not a complete waste of time, but it just doesn't have enough of them. The F-18C MLU-2 I was kind of happy about because I thought maybe they would have Mavericks on it, and I looked at it and it doesn't. It has laser-guided bombs and GPS-guided bombs, which a lot of times are just a little too slow to have a meaningful impact on the meta on the ground. You can carry a lot of AMRAAMs, which is nice. However, the current C model AMRAAM is not exactly up to specs. It is currently significantly underperforming, and you're better off with the B model AMRAAMs, and you usually don't need that many AMRAAMs in a ground RB match anyway. You only need about 4 to 6 at max, so on the whole the MLU-2 is not really worth it in most situations. Honestly, you could drop down to the JAS-39A and that would drop your entire lineup down to only 12.0 in ground, which would generally be better, at least in terms of the matchmaker. The only real difference between the A and the C from a practical level is that the A doesn't have access to AMRAAMs, but does still have Mavericks and a targeting pod. With all that being said, Sweden only walks away with a C grade from the Fixedwing cast category. The problem is that you just don't combine enough air-to-ground and air-to-air on the same platform, so you either have to pick and choose between doing air-to-ground and not really being as able to defend yourself against other jets, or going all in on the cap roll and not being able to contribute to the ground battle directly in any meaningful way. And the F-18C MLU didn't really help the equation. It does have more mixed loadouts, but the mixed loadouts don't exactly have the weapons you're looking for at this point in the meta. It's not completely useless, but it does have some pretty harsh limitations, and that's why it only gets the C grade. And last and very much least for Sweden is the tank destroyer category. We have the PVV-302 Bill, and this is the only thing even close to top tier that can kind of sort of fill the tank destroyer role. This vehicle has a lot of significant issues that keep it from being even remotely viable in top tier, despite the fact that its missile does technically work in a top tier environment. This is very similar to the Soviet Chrysanthema S missile system in that the missile works, but no other part of the vehicle does. So briefly going through the myriad of downsides to this system, it's relatively slow, it's not actually that short, and it's incredibly weak to basically all fire up to and including things like 50 cals. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the launcher was not so awkwardly positioned. You only have 1 missile in the launcher, but more importantly, it's coupled to the turret, but doesn't have the same traverse and elevation as the 20mm. So essentially what you get is a scenario where you're going to have to regularly switch to the Bill missile, basically hard switch to it and control it manually in order to get maximum depression on the launcher. However, the launcher itself can only traverse so much without rotating the 20mm turret, so this leads to a lot of awkward scenarios where you have to flip back and forth between the 20mm to make sure your turret's in the right location, but then go to the Bill missile to make sure you get the depression, etc, etc. The whole launcher is just a very awkward setup that only works in very specific static situations, and that's about it. That being said, the Bill missile is definitely the only thing that really keeps this thing afloat in terms of having any hope of killing a top tier MBT. The top attack capability of the Bill is noticeably better than the TOW-2B, so you can kill anything in the game with this vehicle if you can get into a position, fire your missile, and hit them. And that is the real problem, is that it's not very good at doing any of those things. So this is an F tier, you definitely shouldn't take it. It is not suitable for the top tier environment in any way, and technically having a missile that can can kill things is just not good enough. So this is the part where I give some miscellaneous thoughts on the lineup and the nation before giving you my overall grade on how I think the nation performs at top tier. Down below you will see my current preferred lineup and some interesting notes about this lineup. I do ultimately use the AHS, although I can't entirely guarantee that you won't get just as good results with the Mi-28A. The Swedish helicopter tree is very anemic in general, and I think the Mi-28A allowing you to skip basically the entire helicopter tree actually makes it a pretty useful premium, even if I don't generally like recommending premium vehicles in these types of reviews. I ultimately go with the Gripen because simply having access to the Mavericks makes it, in my opinion, better than the MLU-2, but honestly, a lot of times all it's really doing is the cap roll, so you could just as easily use one of the F-18s and do perfectly fine. I am heavily considering debating dropping down to the JS-39A and only getting the Sparrows just because I honestly do not care enough about these cap planes, but at least for now I am still sticking with the JS-39C. As far as the MBTs, the two that I'm using are the 122B Plus just because it has all of the extra armor, and that's the reason why I use the 122s is for that brawling roll, and if I'm not using the one with all of the extra armor, why am I even taking it? And of course the 2A6, because as I've said on previous videos, I love the 2A6. I think it's just in general a great tank, especially for doing flanking and sniping. As far as the light tanks, I do honestly really like the 9120 and CB90 Mark IV combination. I feel they work really well together, and they also work really well to complement the MBT lineup. Additionally, I'm using the L90A because, as I said in the anti-air section, I have noticed more often than not, a lot of the better pilots are trying to actively avoid radar as much as possible, so the Ito 90M just wasn't getting enough shots, so I do think the Eld is probably the way to go, but it's not definite, and honestly you could kind of skip it and generally do fine in most matches. One thing I will say right now is that playing Germany before playing Sweden, especially after Gaijin have spent a lot of time buffing Germany and giving it a lot of options it was previously lacking, and also adding the 2A7V, definitely felt like a bit of a downgrade. While the Swedish light tanks are certainly a welcome change, I do think the 9120 and the 90 Mark IV are pretty competent light tanks. The MBT lineup felt a lot more underwhelming. The helicopter in Sweden is just terrible compared to Germany. The planes just aren't very good, even compared to the Typhoon, which is a pretty mediocre cast plane. And on the whole, Sweden right now, especially with Germany getting the Iris-T system, just feels like bad Germany outside of the light tanks. Of course, Germany right now is arguably one of the best nations that you can play at top tier, so it does beg the question of how good are the light tanks and how much do those make up for some of the other areas, especially the very anemic air that Sweden has. And I think they do actually make up for it quite a bit. The ground game has been always traditionally pretty important in ground RB. Even when people think planes are dominant, a lot of the games are still decided on the ground, and the importance of the ground game has only gotten more important with the addition of more high tier anti-airs and also pushing the air spawns all the way out to about 24 kilometers. So the light tanks are pretty important. I can't discount that, even if some of the other areas like the MBTs do just feel like you're doing Germany but worse. Overall, I would give Sweden a pretty firm A grade. The MBTs are fun and effective, the light tanks are fun and effective, the anti-air is good enough for most situations, and your planes can fulfill the CAS or cap roles, at least somewhat if you do see an opportunity to do so, and you do technically have helicopters that can kill things if you see the opportunity and you know how to use a helicopter. Overall, the lineup doesn't have any glaring deficiencies of things it can't do, even if it does have some pretty harsh limitations on some areas, and the most important and fundamental parts of a ground RB lineup at top tier right now, the MBTs, the light tanks, and even to a lesser extent the Swedish anti-air, are good enough to see you to the end of a match without any major issues. The MBTs themselves are pretty strong. I think it's easy to underestimate how much extra durability you get on the 122B Plus because of the side panels on the upper hull and the upper side of the turret, because not just from a flat shot from the side, but also at a sharp angle, they can really eat some shells and reduce the amount of damage they do in conjunction with the spall liners and result in the tank being very hard to kill, especially in a hull down position. So ultimately, while Sweden has experienced a bit of a fall from grace, as it used to easily be one of the best top tier lineups and used to basically beat Germany but better, it's still in a pretty good spot, and I feel like you could do a lot worse than Sweden at top tier at this point in the game. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Sweden top tier. What are your favorite vehicles? I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, you enjoyed it, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.